The cottage that perches on the edge of Whitmore's End has weathered 47 years of coastal storms, its stone walls worn smooth by salt spray and wind that carries voices from the deep places where ordinary folk dare not venture. Here, where the cliff path ends in tumbled rocks and tangled kelp, marks the boundary between land and sea, Eleanor Ashworth tends her garden and mends her nets with the patience of someone who has learned that isolation brings peace more reliably than company. The villagers consider her strange but harmless, a woman whose husband vanished with the fishing fleet 20 years past, whose children never lived to see their first winter, whose grief transformed into something useful rather than bitter through decades of choosing kindness over despair. They bring her their sick animals when the veterinarian costs too much, their mending when nimble fingers make the difference between warmth and cold, their worries when no one else will listen without judgment or unsolicited advice about proper Christian resignation. But it is the sea that shapes her daily existence more than human community, that restless presence whose moods determine whether the tide pools offer fresh mussels or empty shells, whether the morning brings driftwood for her fire or debris that speaks of distant storms and tragedies that claimed lives she will never know. She has learned its rhythms as others learn the church calendar, understanding that the ocean gives and takes according to laws older than human understanding, but no less reliable for their mystery. On the night when storm winds drive waves higher than anyone can remember, when even the oldest fishermen secure their boats and retreat to inland shelters rather than risk their vessels against nature's fury, Eleanor stands at her window watching water reclaim the beach with the kind of violence that reshapes coastlines and leaves new channels where solid ground existed at dawn. Tomorrow, she knows, the tide will reveal what the storm has torn from deep places and cast upon the shore, hoping it will be driftwood and shells, rather than the heartbreak that sometimes follows tempests that reach into ocean territories where human eyes were never meant to see. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The dawn following the great storm reveals a beach transformed by violence that has carved new inlets through familiar landscape while depositing treasures and tragedies in equal measure along tide lines that mark the sea's furthest reach into terrestrial territory. Eleanor picks her way across rocks still slick with spray, gathering driftwood that will feed her fire and shells that speak of distant reefs torn apart by winds that reached into underwater kingdoms with destructive force that recognizes no boundaries between surface world and oceanic realm. It is the flash of silver among dark kelp that stops her methodical collection and draws her toward tide pool where yesterday solid rock created barrier between land and sea, because storms reshape geography, as well as depositing debris from places that existed only in sailor stories, until tempest brought evidence of their reality to shores that ordinary weather could never reach. "Dear God," she whispers, recognizing shapes that resolve into small bodies whose delicate features and gill slits mark them as beings from stories that fishermen tell in taverns, when rum loosens tongues that sobriety keeps closed about creatures they glimpse in deep waters, but never dare describe to wives who worry enough about ordinary storms, without adding supernatural concerns to reasonable ears about men who risk their lives gathering food from sea that claims vessels and crews with casual indifference. The children, for children they clearly are despite webbed fingers and scales that catch morning light like scattered jewels, lie tangled in seaweed that probably saved their lives by cushioning impact against rocks that would have shattered bones too delicate for such violence. Their breathing comes in shallow gasps that suggest internal injuries beyond Eleanor's ability to diagnose, but their hearts beat steadily enough to offer hope that immediate death does not threaten, despite obvious trauma from experience that brought them far from ocean depths, to land that offers no natural survival for beings designed for underwater existence. "Easy now," she murmurs, approaching slowly despite urgency that demands immediate action, because frightened children bite regardless of species, and these bear claws designed for marine predators, rather than gentle human contact. "I won't hurt you. Let me help." The larger child, a girl perhaps 8 years old if merfolk measure age according to human understanding, opens eyes that hold depths more ancient than her apparent youth, while intelligence flickers through pain that speaks of injuries requiring attention beyond simple wounds that time and rest might heal. Her gaze fixes on Eleanor with mixture of terror and desperate hope that transcends species barriers to communicate need, that any mother recognizes regardless of biological differences that separate terrestrial from oceanic life. Water, the child whispers, voice carrying harmonics that resonate with frequencies human ears can barely detect, while conveying meaning that transcends language barriers through universal recognition of suffering that requires immediate response, regardless of practical difficulties that helping creates for individuals whose resources barely sustain personal survival. Of course, dear. Water and warmth and food if you can manage it, Eleanor replies while calculating logistics that encompass transport that will not worsen injuries, treatment that serves unfamiliar physiology, and concealment that protects discoveries which villagers might interpret as demonic, rather than simply different from familiar experience with ordinary marine life that poses no challenge to comfortable understanding of proper natural boundaries. The journey back to cottage requires careful navigation across rocks that challenge Eleanor's aging joints, while supporting weight that strains muscles unaccustomed to carrying burdens heavier than firewood or market purchases. But necessity provides strength that extends beyond normal physical limits when circumstances demand resources that ordinary life does not require for survival that operates according to predictable patterns rather than emergency response to situations that defy previous experience. The smaller child, a boy whose features suggest kinship despite variations that indicate either different parentage or species characteristics that Eleanor lacks knowledge to interpret, remains unconscious throughout transport. That probably saves him shock of witnessing alien environment that underwater beings might find as disturbing as humans experience when contemplating oceanic depths that opera according to principles that terrestrial existence rarely encounters. There now, she murmurs, while arranging them near her fireplace, where warmth will counteract exposure that threatens hypothermia, despite physical adaptations that permit underwater existence, requiring different thermal regulation than land-based life that depends on air temperature rather than water currents that moderate oceanic climate, according to global patterns that affect marine environment. Through circulation that distributes heat according to planetary rather than local weather systems. The practical challenges of caring for merfolk children reveal themselves immediately through physiology that requires constant moisture to prevent respiratory distress, while needing nutrition that Eleanor's simple pantry cannot provide, without innovation that adapts terrestrial resources to serve oceanic needs. Saltwater proves essential for gill function, while freshwater offers relief for injuries that require cleaning beyond what seawater can accomplish, despite its natural antiseptic properties that serve marine life more effectively than terrestrial alternatives. Can you tell me your names? Eleanor asks, when consciousness returns to both children, their eyes reflecting intelligence that transcends immediate physical discomfort to encompass awareness of predicament that places them completely dependent on terrestrial kindness, that they have no reason to trust based on previous experience with human contact, that merfolk culture probably teaches children to avoid for reasons that ocean dwellers understand better than land-based individuals whose knowledge of interspecies relationships comes primarily from stories that emphasize conflict rather than cooperation. Neris, the girl responds with voice that carries underwater acoustics poorly adapted to air-based communication, while maintaining clarity that suggests intelligence capable of language adaptation, despite biological constraints that make terrestrial conversation challenging for beings designed for oceanic existence that operates through different sensory modalities than human communication that depends on atmospheric sound transmission. Kayla, whispers the boy, his voice even more fragile than his sister's, while eyes that should hold childhood innocence instead reflect trauma that speaks of recent experiences that children should never endure, regardless of species boundaries that separate merfolk from human understanding of proper child protection that serves developmental needs, rather than exposing young minds to violence that creates psychological damage extending far beyond physical injuries. Beautiful names for beautiful children, Eleanor says with gentleness, that acknowledges their fear while establishing tone of safety, that transcends species differences through universal maternal instincts that recognize child welfare as priority transcending biological boundaries between terrestrial and oceanic existence. Can you tell me what happened to bring you so far from home? The children exchange glances that communicate more than words while revealing relationship dynamics that suggest mutual protection forged through shared trauma that created emotional bonds extending beyond simple sibling affection to encompass survival partnership that serves psychological defense against experiences that neither should have endured, regardless of oceanic dangers that adult merfolk might consider normal environmental hazards. Storm took us, Neris explains with halting speech that encompasses linguistic barriers alongside emotional difficulty discussing events that brought them to terrestrial environment, through circumstances that separated them from oceanic community that should have provided protection for young members whose survival depends on adult guardianship, rather than individual resources that children can possess regardless of species advantages that maturity might eventually provide. Dark ones came during storm, Kala adds with whisper, that suggests fear extending beyond immediate physical discomfort to encompass psychological trauma that speaks of encounters with threats that oceanic children learn to fear through cultural education that teaches appropriate caution about dangers that marine environment contains, despite protective community structures that normally shield young merfolk from predators that hunt vulnerable individuals. Dark ones? Eleanor prompts gently, recognizing that information about circumstances that created current situation might prove essential for protecting children from ongoing threats that could extend beyond simple separation from oceanic community to encompass pursuit by hostile forces that view young merfolk as valuable resources for purposes that no child should serve, regardless of species boundaries that separate terrestrial from marine existence. Shadowfish that swim in deep places where light cannot reach. Neris attempts explanation that encompasses concepts for which human language provides inadequate vocabulary, while conveying meaning that suggests encounters with oceanic entities that adult merfolk fear enough to warn children about dangers that normal marine predators do not represent despite natural hazards that underwater exist. NC encompasses through environmental challenges that differ from terrestrial threats. The halting explanation reveals enough to understand that children's separation from oceanic community resulted from more than simple storm displacement, that they fled from something that threatened survival in ways that made dangerous journey to terrestrial environment seem preferable to remaining in underwater territory, where unknown dangers posed threats that young minds interpreted as Han exile from oceanic community that normally provides essential protection for merfolk children, whose survival depends on adult guardianship. You're safe here, Eleanor promises, with conviction that encompasses both personal commitment and practical assessment of cottage location, that provides isolation from village scrutiny while offering defensive advantages that protect residents from both terrestrial and oceanic threats through geographic position that serves multiple security purposes, despite appearance of vulnerability that isolate. Coastal residents might suggest to observers unfamiliar with strategic benefits that location provides. Safe until they find us, Kayla whispers, with fear that suggests trauma extending beyond immediate physical discomfort to encompass psychological understanding of pursuit that continues despite current refuge, that provides only temporary protection against threats that possess resources for extended search that could eventually locate children despite terrestrial concealment that serves short-term security rather than permanent solution to dangers that motivated original flight from oceanic territory. The revelation that children face ongoing pursuit rather than simple displacement creates recognition that assistance encompasses more than temporary care, while they recover from injuries sustained during storm-driven journey to terrestrial environment. That protection requires sustained commitment to defending young refugees, whose survival depends on maintaining concealment from hostile forces that possess unknown capabilities for locating missing persons, despite geographical barriers that separate oceanic from terrestrial territory. But it is evening recognition of oceanic presence that transforms simple rescue into political situation, extending far beyond individual humanitarian response to encompass diplomatic considerations that affect relationships between terrestrial and marine communities, whose interaction normally operates through careful protocols that maintain separation rather than direct contact that could create misunderstandings threatening both populations through cultural differences that emphasize caution over cooperation. They're coming, Neris announces with certainty that transcends simple childhood perception, to encompass oceanic sensitivity that detects approaching presence through environmental awareness that merfolk possess as natural adaptation to underwater existence that requires constant attention to currents and chemical signatures that provide information about distant events affecting local security, through oceanic communication that operates beyond human sensory capabilities. Who's coming? Eleanor asks while moving toward window that provides view of beach, where evening tide brings changes that normal coastal observation might interpret as natural phenomenon, rather than approaching presence that merfolk children recognize through species-specific awareness that transcends ordinary human understanding of environmental indicators that provide advance warning about significant events. Our people, Kayla explains with mixture of relief and apprehension, that suggests complex emotions about rescue that should bring joy, but encompasses concerns about consequences that reunion might create for terrestrial benefactor, whose assistance violated normal boundaries between species communities that maintain separation through mutual agreement, rather than hostile enforcement of territorial restrictions. The horizon that moments before showed empty ocean now reveals shapes that resolve into organized formation approaching shoreline, with purpose that transcends simple search pattern to encompass military precision that suggests official rather than casual response to missing children, whose disappearance apparently triggered mobilization, extending beyond family concern into community responsibility. That merfolk society takes seriously enough to deploy significant resources for recovery operations. Will they harm me for helping you? Eleanor asks with practical concern that acknowledges potential consequences of interspecies contact that operated without official permission, while recognizing that children's welfare required immediate assistance regardless of diplomatic protocols that might govern proper procedures for terrestrial aid to oceanic refugees seeking emergency shelter from threats that motivated dangerous journey to alien environment. They will want to understand, Neris replies with uncertainty, that reflects childhood knowledge insufficient for predicting adult decisions about complex situations that encompass both gratitude for assistance and concern about security implications that unauthorized terrestrial contact might create for oceanic community that maintains careful separation from human society, despite shared coastal environment that creates inevitable interaction possibilities. As formation resolves into individual figures, whose approach demonstrates organization that encompasses both rescue capability and military preparedness, Eleanor understands that tomorrow will bring confrontation that determines whether humanitarian assistance receives recognition or punishment according to oceanic law that she knows nothing about, but must trust, will honor universal principles that to protect those who protect children regardless of species boundaries that separate marine from terrestrial existence. The first light of dawn reveals formations on the water that transform Eleanor's isolated cottage into diplomatic frontier where terrestrial and oceanic realms must negotiate terms that honor both child welfare and interspecies protocols that neither community has previously tested through circumstances requiring immediate cooperation, despite cultural barriers that emphasize separation over collaboration between populations whose interaction normally operates through careful avoidance rather than direct contact. The shapes that emerge from morning mist resolve into beings whose presence reshapes the very atmosphere around cottage that yesterday sheltered only human loneliness, but now serves as sanctuary requiring protection from forces that could reshape coastal geography through powers that terrestrial existence rarely encounters, except through stories that fishermen share about encounters with oceanic entities whose capabilities extend far beyond ordinary marine life. Stay calm, Eleanor murmurs to children whose tension fills cottage with electricity that speaks of inherited abilities awakening under stress, that threatens security they found through terrestrial assistance, whose continuation depends on adult negotiations that will determine whether humanitarian aid receives recognition or creates complications that affect both rescued refugees and their benefae. Kitor, whose isolation provides no protection against oceanic authority that operates according to laws she cannot understand. The figure that leads oceanic delegation emerges from water with presence that commands attention through natural authority that encompasses both political position and personal power, whose scope becomes evident as shoreline itself responds to approach that draws tide higher than natural patterns should permit, while creating atmospheric pressure that affects terrestrial environment through oceani. See influence extending beyond normal geographical boundaries. Queen Nerissa of the Abyssal Courts, Neris whispers, with awe that encompasses both recognition of royal authority and surprise that missing children have triggered response from highest levels of oceanic governance, whose involvement suggests political implications, extending far beyond simple family emergency, to encompass matters that affect kingdom stability, through circumstances that brought own royalty to terrestrial refuge requiring diplomatic resolution. Your grandmother, Kayla adds with revelation that transforms children's identity from unknown refugees into members of oceanic royal family whose disappearance created crisis, extending beyond personal loss to encompass succession questions that threaten kingdom stability, through absence of heirs, whose safety ensures political continuity, according to inheritance laws that govern oceanic sovereign. Tie through bloodline verification that proves legitimate authority. The recognition that cottage shelters oceanic royalty, whose rescue requires highest-level diplomatic response, creates understanding that Eleanor's humanitarian assistance has created political situation extending far beyond individual kindness to encompass interspecies relations that could reshape coastal diplomacy through precedent that establishes new protocols for emergency cooperation between communities whose interaction normally operates through careful separation rather than direct assistance. Grandmother comes when family faces threats that require royal response. Nerys explains with childhood knowledge that encompasses both personal relationship and political understanding about circumstances that trigger monarchical involvement in situations that normally receive community rather than governmental attention through delegation of authority that serves kingdom efficiency while maintaining royal focus on matters affecting sovereignty rather than individual welfare. The approaching delegation reveals organization that encompasses both rescue capability and ceremonial dignity, appropriate to royal expedition, whose purpose transcends simple child recovery, to establish diplomatic precedent that honors terrestrial assistance while addressing security concerns that unauthorized interspecies contact, creates for oceanic community whose survival depends on maintaining careful boundaries that protect underwater territories from surface world interference. Will she be angry with you for coming to land? Eleanor asks with maternal concern that transcends species differences to encompass universal recognition of childhood vulnerability to adult disapproval, whose consequences could affect young minds already traumatized by experiences that forced dangerous journey to alien environment, seeking protection from threats that oceanic community should have prevented through territorial defense. Grandmother protects family above all other considerations. Kayla replies with confidence that reflects personal relationship, extending beyond formal royal duty to encompass genuine affection that serves emotional security, while acknowledging that royal authority encompasses both personal love and political responsibility that must balance individual welfare against community safety that require careful consideration of precedent that current situation establishes. The formation that resolves into distinct figures reveals escort, whose composition suggests military preparation, alongside diplomatic intention, warriors whose presence acknowledges potential threats, while delegates whose bearing indicates peaceful purpose create combination that demonstrates oceanic approach to unknown situations that requires readiness for multiple contingencies while maintaining primary focus on diplomatic resolution that serves kingdom interests through cooperation rather than conflict. I should greet them properly, Eleanor decides, while recognizing that ignorance of oceanic protocol could create misunderstandings that complicate negotiations, whose success determines whether humanitarian assistance receives recognition or creates ongoing problems that affect both rescued children and terrestrial benefactor, whose future welfare depends on establishing positive relationship with oceanic authority whose power extends far beyond ordinary diplomatic influence. Stay behind grandmother when she arrives, Nerys advises with childhood wisdom that encompasses practical understanding of royal etiquette, whose proper observance ensures respectful interaction while avoiding protocol violations that could complicate negotiations requiring careful navigation between formal requirements and personal emotion that affects decision-making process, whose outcome determines multiple futures through diplomatic precedent. The approach that brings oceanic delegation to cottage threshold creates moment where terrestrial hospitality intersects with oceanic authority, requiring immediate decisions about proper greeting that honors both human custom and merfolk protocol, while acknowledging unique circumstances that brought royal children to terrestrial refuge, requiring protection from threats that motivated dangerous journey to alien environment. The figure that emerges from ocean depths carries presence that transforms simple coastal cottage into throne room, where diplomatic negotiations will determine precedent affecting interspecies relations through resolution that must honor both child welfare and community security, while establishing foundation for future cooperation that serves mutual benefit rather than competitive advantage that could destabilize careful balance, maintaining peaceful coexistence between territorial neighbors. Queen Nerissa, Eleanor acknowledges with courtesy that encompasses both respect for royal authority and recognition of shared concern for child welfare that transcends political considerations to unite grandmother and rescuer through common purpose that serves young lives whose protection requires cooperation, overcoming cultural differences that emphasize separation over collaboration between communities whose shared environment demands occasional interaction. Eleanor Ashworth, the Queen replies, with a voice that carries oceanic depths while maintaining warmth appropriate to personal gratitude that acknowledges humanitarian assistance, whose value extends beyond simple kindness to encompass courage that risked unknown consequences for child welfare, that transcends species boundaries through universal recognition of innocence, requiring protection, regardless of political complications that assistance might create. Your Majesty honors my humble cottage. Eleanor responds with honesty that acknowledges unprecedented nature of royal visit, while maintaining dignity appropriate to hostess, whose hospitality provided sanctuary for oceanic royalty, whose safety required terrestrial assistance that operated without knowledge of political implications, that rescue created for interspecies relations requiring diplomacy. See resolution. Your cottage honors itself through kindness that transcends species boundaries to protect children whose welfare required assistance from source that oceanic resources could not provide during crisis that separated family through circumstances requiring immediate terrestrial aid. Queen Nerissa states with formal acknowledgement that recognizes humanitarian assistance while establishing diplomacy. See framework for negotiations that must address both gratitude and security concerns. The exchange that establishes mutual respect creates foundation for discussion that encompasses both personal emotion and political necessity through recognition that child welfare requires cooperation, transcending cultural barriers, while addressing legitimate security concerns that unauthorized interspecies contact creates for communities whose survival depends on maintaining careful boundaries. That protect territorial sovereignty through diplomatic protocols. The children were injured and frightened, Eleanor explains with maternal directness, that focuses attention on practical circumstances, requiring immediate response, rather than political theory about proper procedures for interspecies emergency assistance that operates according to humanitarian necessity, rather than diplomatic protocol designed for non-emergency interaction between territorial neighbors whose cooperation serves mutual benefit. Their injuries heal through terrestrial care that provided medical attention beyond oceanic resources available during emergency circumstances that required immediate assistance. Queen Nerissa observes with clinical assessment that acknowledges practical benefits of rescue, while recognizing longer-term implications that extend beyond immediate medical treatment to encompass emotional healing requiring continued stability rather than immediate return to oceanic environment. They spoke of dark ones that pursue them. Eleanor continues with concern that encompasses ongoing threats requiring protective response rather than simple rescue from immediate danger that brought children to terrestrial refuge through circumstances that suggest continuing pursuit by hostile forces whose capabilities remain unknown, but whose persistence threatens child welfare, despite current sanctuary. Shadow-tide entities that hunt oceanic royalty for purposes that threaten kingdom stability through succession interference. Queen Nerissa explains with political context that transforms children's experience from simple predator encounter into targeted assault on oceanic sovereignty, requiring comprehensive defensive response that extends beyond individual protection to encompass territorial security that affects entire kingdom through threats to inherited authority. Are they safe here? Temporarily protected through terrestrial location that shadow-tide entities cannot easily access, without violating interspecies agreements that prevent oceanic forces from operating within coastal territories that serve as neutral ground between territorial authorities, the Queen clarifies, while acknowledging limitations of current sanctuary that provides short-term security rather than permanent solution to ongoing threats. The revelation that cottage location provides diplomatic protection rather than simple geographical isolation creates understanding that Eleanor's assistance encompasses more than humanitarian aid to include inadvertent provision of political sanctuary that operates through international law rather than personal generosity. making continued cooperation essential for child protection that depends on maintaining terrestrial residence rather than immediate return to oceanic territory. What resolution serves both child safety and kingdom security? Eleanor asks with practical focus that acknowledges political complexity while maintaining priority concern for young welfare that transcends diplomatic considerations to encompass moral obligation for protecting innocence, regardless of species boundaries or political complications that assistance might create for interspecies relations requiring careful negotiation. Extended terrestrial residence that provides education in surface world survival while maintaining oceanic cultural connection through regular contact that serves child development while ensuring security that oceanic environment cannot currently guarantee, Queen Nerissa proposes with solution that honors both immediate safety requirements and long-term political considerations. Meaning they would remain here with me? Meaning arrangement that serves child welfare through terrestrial guardianship while maintaining royal family connection that ensures proper education in oceanic culture alongside surface world survival skills that current circumstances make essential for their protection through environmental diversity that provides multiple refuge options. The proposal that transforms temporary rescue into extended guardianship creates recognition that humanitarian assistance has evolved into permanent responsibility, requiring resources that extend beyond Eleanor's simple cottage existence, while acknowledging that child welfare demands stability, that casual arrangements cannot provide through sustained commitment rather than temporary charity that serves immediate need without addressing long-term requirements. I accept responsibility for their welfare, Eleanor states with resolution that encompasses both personal commitment and practical understanding, that child protection requires dedication, transcending convenience while acknowledging that such arrangement serves purposes larger than individual preference through cooperation that honors both humanitarian necessity and political wisdom. Then arrangement serves kingdom security while providing child welfare through terrestrial guardianship that maintains oceanic connection necessary for cultural education alongside practical survival skills required for environmental adaptation. Queen Nerissa concludes with satisfaction that acknowledges successful negotiation, creating solution that serves multiple purposes through partnership, honoring both species requirements. The diplomatic agreement that establishes formal guardianship creates precedent for interspecies cooperation while providing foundation for relationship that serves child welfare through sustained terrestrial residence, supplemented by oceanic cultural education that prepares them for eventual return to underwater community, when security conditions permit reunion with royal family, whose protection requires temporary separation serving long-term safety. As negotiations conclude with mutual satisfaction that encompasses both personal gratitude and political wisdom, the relationship established between oceanic royalty and terrestrial guardian demonstrates that humanitarian assistance can create diplomatic opportunity when guided by shared concern for child welfare that transcends species boundaries through cooperation, serving collective benefit, there than individual advantage that could destabilize careful balance, maintaining peaceful coexistence between territorial neighbors whose interaction requires mutual respect and understanding. The months that follow diplomatic agreement transform Eleanor's isolated cottage into unique household, where terrestrial routine accommodates oceanic needs through innovations that serve child welfare while maintaining cultural connections essential for identity development that honors both species heritage and practical adaptation to environmental circumstances, requiring flexibility rather than rigid adherence to traditional approaches that serve single environment existence. The daily rhythms that emerge reflect careful balance between oceanic requirements and terrestrial resources through solutions that encompass modified diet, incorporating sea vegetation alongside land-based nutrition, educational activities that include both surface world practical skills and underwater cultural traditions, transmitted through stories that maintain connection to Oceanic Heritage Day. Despite physical separation from marine community, morning tide brings fresh kelp for breakfast preparation, Eleanor announces, while checking supplies that combine traditional human pantry items with oceanic foods that Queen Nerissa's regular visits provide through diplomatic channels that ensure children receive proper nutrition, despite terrestrial residents that cannot naturally supply all dietary requirements essential for healthy merfolk development. Can we help with harvest? Nerys asks with enthusiasm that demonstrates successful adaptation to terrestrial environment, while maintaining oceanic interests that serve cultural continuity through participation in activities that bridge species differences by incorporating marine knowledge into land-based resource management that benefits both guardian and children through collaborative effort. Careful with the collection nets, Eleanor cautions, while supervising activity that provides practical education and survival skills that serve dual purposes by teaching terrestrial resource gathering while honoring oceanic traditions that emphasize environmental harmony over exploitative approaches that damage ecosystems through unsustainable harvesting, that depletes rather than maintains natural abundance. The educational program that develops through informal teaching encompasses both literacy and human language that serves communication with terrestrial community and oceanic lore that maintains cultural connection through stories that preserve knowledge essential for eventual return to underwater society, whose traditions require transmission across generations through oral preservation rather than written documentation that surface world education emphasizes. Tell us about the coral gardens, Kayla requests during evening story time that serves both entertainment and cultural education through narratives that maintain oceanic connection while providing historical context that helps children understand their heritage despite physical separation from marine community that normally provides such knowledge through direct experience rather than secondhand. Description: gardens that bloom in underwater valleys where sunlight penetrates crystal-clear waters to nourish living reefs that serve as foundation for oceanic civilization through natural architecture that provides both shelter and sustenance for communities that work in harmony with environmental cycles rather than against natural processes. Eleanor recounts from information provided during royal visits that supplement her terrestrial knowledge with oceanic wisdom. Will we see them again? Neris asks, with longing that encompasses both homesickness and realistic concern about security conditions that continue preventing return to underwater territories where shadow-tide entities maintain pursuit that threatens royal children, whose protection requires continued terrestrial residence, despite personal desire for oceanic reunion with family and community. When safety permits reunion that serves your welfare, rather than exposing you to ongoing threats that your grandmother's forces continue addressing through military campaigns that protect oceanic sovereignty, while working toward conditions that allow your return without compromising kingdom security, Eleanor explains, with honest assessment that acknowledges uncertainty while maintaining hope, Bass. Ed on regular diplomatic updates. The intelligence reports that Queen Nerissa shares during monthly visits reveal ongoing conflict that encompasses more than simple pursuit of royal children, to include broader assault on oceanic sovereignty through shadow-tide infiltration that threatens territorial integrity, requiring comprehensive defensive response that protects entire kingdom, rather than simply securing individual safety. Shadow-tide forces represent ancient faction that seeks oceanic control through elimination of current royal bloodline, whose authority maintains democratic governance, rather than authoritarian rule that serves factional advantage over collective welfare. Queen Nerissa explains during confidential briefing that provides political context for security concerns, requiring continued vigilance, despite the children's successful terrestrial adaptation. How long might such conflict continue? Eleanor asks with practical concern that encompasses both child welfare and personal planning for extended guardianship that requires resources beyond her simple cottage existence, while acknowledging that open-ended commitment serves purposes larger than individual convenience through dedication that honors both humanitarian obligation and diplomatic partnership. Indeterminate duration that depends on military success against enemies whose resources remain unknown, despite intelligence efforts that continue revealing scope of threat that extends beyond anticipated resistance to encompass coordinated assault on oceanic political structure requiring systematic response through alliance building that strengthens defensive capabilities. The Queen replies with honesty that acknowledges uncertainty while emphasizing ongoing commitment to resolution. But it is personal development of relationship between guardian and children that provides most compelling evidence of arrangement success, because initial emergency assistance has evolved into authentic family unit that serves emotional needs, alongside practical requirements, through bonds that transcend species differences to encompass genuine affection that honors both individual worth and collective welfare. Grandmother Eleanor, Kayla addresses during quiet moment, that reveals transformation of formal guardianship into personal relationship that encompasses not just care provider and dependence, but authentic family connection that serves emotional security through recognition that love transcends biological boundaries, when sustained commitment creates bonds that honor both individual dignity and collective responsibility. Yes, dear one. Eleanor responds with warmth that encompasses both maternal affection and recognition that children have adapted to terrestrial existence while maintaining oceanic identity through balanced approach that honors both heritage and current circumstances, requiring flexibility rather than rigid adherence to traditional expectations about proper cultural expression. Will you come with us when we return to ocean? The question touches territory that Eleanor has avoided contemplating, despite recognition that successful arrangement creates bonds that extend beyond temporary assistance to encompass permanent relationship requiring consideration of future possibilities that honor both individual preference and practical necessity for continued connection that serves child welfare through sustained family stability. I cannot survive underwater as you cannot survive indefinitely on land, Eleanor replies with gentle honesty that acknowledges biological limitations while maintaining focus on relationship that transcends environmental constraints through emotional connection that serves purposes larger than physical proximity through sustained commitment that honors both individual welfare and collective responsibility. But visits are possible through magic that permits temporary adaptation, allowing brief periods of cross-environmental contact that maintains family connection, despite species differences that require primary residence in appropriate habitat. Neris observes with hopeful recognition that relationship need not end with return to oceanic community. Queen Nerissa mentioned such possibilities. Eleanor confirms with acknowledgement that diplomatic discussions have addressed continuation of guardianship relationship through innovative arrangements that honor both species requirements and personal bonds that serve emotional welfare, alongside practical necessity for maintaining cultural connections. The conversation that explores future possibilities creates foundation for sustained relationship that transcends immediate circumstances to encompass long-term commitment that serves both individual satisfaction and collective welfare through partnership, that demonstrates how interspecies cooperation can honor both species requirements while maintaining personal bonds that serve emotional security. As first anniversary of rescue approaches, bringing recognition that temporary emergency assistance has evolved into permanent family arrangement, the household celebrates transformation that encompasses both successful child adaptation to terrestrial existence and guardian adaptation to oceanic cultural requirements through cooperation that serves mutual benefit rather than one-sided accommodation. Today marks 1 year since Storm brought us together, Eleanor observes during morning preparation, that encompasses both terrestrial routine and oceanic ritual, through celebrations that honor both heritage traditions while creating new customs that reflect unique circumstances of interspecies family, whose existence demonstrates successful innovation in child welfare. Today, we celebrate finding family. Neris responds with recognition that rescue created bonds extending beyond simple assistance to encompass authentic relationship that serves emotional needs through connection that transcends species boundaries to honor individual worth within collective responsibility, that shapes both personal satisfaction and community welfare. The anniversary celebration that combines terrestrial customs with oceanic traditions creates model for cultural integration that serves both heritage preservation and environmental adaptation through innovative approaches that honor multiple traditions while creating new possibilities for interspecies cooperation that benefits both communities through demonstration that difference enhances rather than threatens collective welfare. Queen Nerissa's attendance at anniversary celebration provides royal recognition that validates arrangement success while establishing precedent for diplomatic cooperation that serves both kingdom security and individual welfare through partnerships that transcend traditional boundaries to encompass innovative solutions, serving collective benefit through mutual respect and sustained commitment to shared objectives. This household demonstrates that species cooperation serves both individual welfare and collective security through relationships that honor difference, while creating unity through shared commitment to purposes larger than personal preference. Queen Nerissa observes with satisfaction that acknowledges both personal gratitude and political wisdom demonstrated through successful arrangement. Children thrive through love that transcends species boundaries while maintaining cultural connections that serve identity development alongside practical adaptation to environmental circumstances requiring flexibility rather than rigid adherence to traditional approaches. Eleanor responds with recognition that success encompasses both emotional welfare and practical achievement through cooperate. The formal recognition that validates arrangement success creates foundation for continued partnership while establishing precedent for future interspecies cooperation that serves both communities through demonstration that humanitarian assistance can evolve into diplomatic opportunity when guided by shared commitment to child welfare that transcends political considerations to honor universal principle serving collective benefit. 3 years after storm brought oceanic royalty to terrestrial refuge, cottage that once sheltered only human loneliness has become center of diplomatic innovation, where daily life demonstrates successful integration of species differences through family bonds that honor both heritage preservation and environmental adaptation, while maintaining connections that serve purposes larger than individual satisfaction. Neris and Kayla's development reveals successful balance between oceanic identity and terrestrial practical skills through education that encompasses both cultural traditions and survival abilities, essential for environmental flexibility that serves security through adaptability rather than rigid dependence on single environment existence that creates vulnerability when circumstances require relocation. Shadow tide threat has been neutralized through military campaigns that establish territorial security permitting safe return to oceanic community when children choose reunion with underwater family, Queen Nerissa announces during diplomatic visit that provides both political update and personal consultation about future arrangements that honor individual preference alongside security consent. Rations. Do you wish to return to ocean home? Eleanor asks with mixture of hope and sadness that encompasses both recognition that children deserve reunion with oceanic community and personal attachment that makes separation difficult, despite understanding that child welfare requires consideration of all options that serve individual development rather than guardian convenience. We wish to maintain both homes, Neris replies, with wisdom that demonstrates successful identity integration, encompassing both oceanic heritage and terrestrial family bonds, through recognition that security comes from multiple refugee options, rather than single environment dependence that creates vulnerability when circumstances require adaptation. Split residence that honors both species requirements and personal relationships through innovative arrangement that maintains family connection while providing cultural education in appropriate environments. Kala adds with practical understanding that modern circumstances require flexibility rather than traditional approaches that assume single environment existence. The arrangement that emerges through family consultation establishes precedent for interspecies cooperation that serves both individual welfare and diplomatic innovation through partnership, that demonstrates how personal relationships can create political opportunity when guided by mutual respect and shared commitment to purposes transcending individual preference. Eleanor's adaptation to periodic underwater residence through magical assistance provides proof that love transcends environmental barriers when sustained commitment creates relationships that honor both individual dignity and collective responsibility through choices that reshape possibilities according to shared values rather than traditional limitations. The diplomatic residence that Queen Nerissa establishes within coastal territory creates permanent embassy that serves both kingdom representation and family support through institutional recognition that validates personal relationships while providing framework for continued interspecies cooperation that benefits both communities. Children who faced extinction through hostile pursuit have become bridges between communities whose cooperation creates security through partnership rather than isolation, that maintains vulnerability through separation, preventing mutual assistance when circumstances require collaborative response to shared challenges. The cottage that provided emergency sanctuary has become symbol of humanitarian principle, that kindness creates opportunity for transformation when guided by wisdom that recognizes individual worth within collective responsibility, demonstrating that saving life can indeed ripple outward into destiny that reshapes both personal future and diplomatic possibility through sustained commitment to purpose larger than immediate convenience. Because storm-driven rescue has evolved into a relationship that proves love transcends species boundaries while creating precedent for cooperation that serves both individual welfare and collective security through innovation that honors difference while building unity through shared commitment to child welfare and community benefit, that transforms isolation into connection through choices that celebrate both heritage preservation and environmental adaptation in perfect harmony. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps. And if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.